First of all, thank you guys so much for having me here today. You are a wonderful and welcoming congregation. I really appreciate you having me here. The other day, I was watching television. Me and my wife were in bed doing it together. We've got to a certain age. This tends to be the way things goes. And an ad for a local politician came on screen. I have daughters, he said, and I won't have them sharing locker rooms with biological males. Boys are boys and girls are girls, and I'm elected in this statement. It was such a surreal experience, having your casual viewing of Bob's Burgers interrupted with transphobic rhetoric. This little reminder that while you go about your life, there are people who can't stop thinking about how much they hate you for simply existing. And I'm not sure whether or not this politician actually hates trans people, or if he's just willing to dishonestly take advantage of the hate and disgust of others in order to be elected. But either way, this rhetoric is dangerous. And fear and insecurity in bathrooms and locker rooms is something many trans and gender nonconforming people have faced their entire lives. I remember when I was growing up as a butch lesbian, the girls' locker room was always a point of anxiety. From a very young age, when you are butch, you learn one very important lesson. The bathrooms and locker rooms are for the femmes. It's for the straight girls and the lesbians and bisexuals who can neatly tuck their identities into the closet in these vulnerable moments. Any gender deviation whatsoever in these spaces is just asking for some blonde to go crying to the principal's office about how you were staring at them. And for those of us who were or are unclosetable, that poses a problem. So you learn a routine. Head down, never make eye contact. Change or pee as quickly as possible. Don't speak, be small, be invisible, because no matter what bathroom you go into, you will be considered an intruder. When I heard about what happened to Nex Benedict for weeks, I couldn't even think about it. It was one of those stories that when I heard it, my brain had to compartmentalize it so that I could get through my day. All I could think of was my own non-binary 11-year-old child. The fact that they too are unclosetable, bold, unwilling or unable to hide away. They are gentle and sensitive and small, and there's a part of me, the part every parent has, that wants them to stay that way, to protect them, to keep them from experiencing any hardship. But when you're the parent of a queer child, especially when you are queer yourself, there is another instinct that exists in constant conflict with the desire to coddle. It is the voice that says, you can't stay small. You can't stay sensitive. You can't stay sweet. You were not born into a world where the luxury of innocence will be granted to you. You are queer, and the sweet queers, the sensitive queers, the nice queers, they don't make it. Toughen up, or they will destroy you. Nex was only 16, and when you get to be my age, you can't help but to look at them and think, this was a baby. Look how little they look. Who could do this? What kind of monster would attack a baby in a school restroom? But when you're queer, you already know the answer, because those people have always been there. They attacked or harassed you in the bathroom, and when they have kids, they teach their kids the same thing. And I remember looking at Nex's face and thinking, did anyone teach them the routine? Were they too young to realize they needed to put their head down in the bathroom? That they were to be silent? That they were not to make eye contact? Did they even know how to make themselves small? But then I thought, would it have mattered? Even if they were a chameleon making themselves as invisible as possible, would it have mattered? To those kids, Nex probably would have still been seen as a threat, as less than human, as a sinful creature who needed to be in some way corrected. And Nex was not just seen as less than human by their attackers, but by the staff at their school who refused to call an ambulance or the police after seeing this wounded child. They were seen as less than human by the police who tried to take Nex's mother out of pressing charges. And after days of being treated like they were unworthy of care or love or respect by society, they passed away. I know many people in this room are not Christian, and I deeply respect that. Y'all do you, that's fine. I'm not here to proselytize, but I do want to explain how I see the figure of Christ. To me, Christ was not just one man, but a metaphor for all those who died at the hands of an unjust world. Jesus said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." And that means that every time a child was killed in war, that was an act committed against Christ. Every time a civil rights leader was shot, Christ was shot. Every time a trans kid died, lonely and afraid, so did Christ. And so many of my fellow Christians keep waiting around for Christ to return, but if you ask me, he already has 1,000,000 times, and every time we kill him. How can we tell these kids that it gets better when things like this are still happening? How do we tell them that it's all going to be okay when they see these ads on television? When they see posts online telling parents of trans kids that they should pray the gay away, that they should beat the queerness out of their children? How do we convince them, and let's be real, sometimes ourselves, that the world will eventually come to terms with us? How do we keep our hope, our faith? I think it's important to remember that even though progress is slow, the winds of change are shifting. Time's arrow will always move forward. In my grandfather's lifetime, being gay and cross-dressing were decriminalized. In my mother's lifetime, homosexuality was removed as a mental illness from the DSM. In my lifetime, we gained the right to marry. Progress is, unfortunately, slow. But look at how much progress we've made in just the last 100 years. It may not feel like it is getting better, but it is. And more importantly, we get better. We get better at community. We get better at caring for one another. We get better at discovering each other, and while we have very little control over how the world treats us, we do have each other. Just a decade ago, it would have been unthinkable for a trans woman to be a congresswoman. But we have trans congresswomen. Just a decade ago, it would have been unthinkable for a trans woman to have a partnership with Lowe's, and Mercury Stardust has a partnership with Lowe's. Just a decade ago, it would have been unheard of for someone like me to be in the pulpit of a church, but here I am. And while society's views of us are still complex, this feels like the final set of labor pains before freedom. The last clawing attempt from a dying ideology to grasp for power. But in the meantime, those labor pains are harsh. So we have to look out for each other. We have to not let our petty arguments and disagreements divide us. Because an isolated trans person is a dead trans person. We cannot survive alone. The good news is, the queer community, despite our many problems, has always come together in times of hardship. In 1969, we came together and had our first pride at the Stonewall riots, which kicked off a new era in the American gay rights movement. In the 70s, the houses, apartments in major cities where queer people lived and created performance groups became safe havens for homeless queer people and queer youth. In the 80s and 90s, at the peak of the AIDS epidemic, we cared for one another, even as we were dying in mass. Even as doctors and nurses refused to touch or care for us. Even when the central coordinator from the CDC told the epidemiologist who spearheaded the AIDS prevention plan to look pretty and do as little as possible, we cared for one another. Lesbian nurses would take leftover medications from AIDS patients who had died and distribute them through underground networks. Drag queens put makeup on each other when their hands became too weak and shaky to do it. We fed each other when nurses refused to come into our rooms and feed the dying. And when we died, we washed each other's bodies and paid for each other's funerals. This is the first generation in a while to have a large number of queer elders they can turn to. Since AIDS and drugs and violence and suicide have made it so we rarely reach old age. When I was growing up, I had no role models, no older queer people to turn to in times of hardship. And I know it is easy to isolate ourselves. It is tempting to sit in our houses with our mimosas or in our clubs with loud music and just hope for the best. But that has never been how we've survived. It is up to us to provide safety and protection to our youth. To let them know that they are not alone, that come what may, we stand together. Many of us had a period in the 2000s and 2010s where there was relative security for queer people. The tragic death of Matthew Shepard turned public perception in our favor. We got comfortable resting on our laurels a bit. We got comfortable in the era of Will and Grace and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, so this current wave of anti-queer sentiment and the rise of the far right has been at best unnerving and terrifying. It feels like we are going backwards, and a lot of us were blindsided by that. But now, we have to be brave. We have to be the grown-ups. We have to protect our queer youth and do so until cases like Nex's stop happening. Our work is not done until every single queer youth in this country feels safe and secure and feels that they can pursue their own dreams and happiness. Our work is not done until our bodies are no longer used as political tools. Our work is not done until every queer person knows that they have a future and that they are loved. Loved by their community, loved by their friends, and loved by God. This is our duty. This is our responsibility. This is how we progress. By caring for each other. By not letting our children fall through the cracks. By letting them know that the guys on television telling them they are evil or perverts are wrong. Because if we don't let them know, they will just believe that there's something wrong with them. It is not that our queer kids need to toughen up. It is that we need to. It is not that our queer kids have to learn the safety routine. It's that we need to make that routine unnecessary. If we are strong, they will see our strength and learn it. That way, if this ever happens again, they are not only alive to lead the generation after them, they are prepared to. So today, we sit with our loss. Today, we cry. And we feel sad, and we feel angry. Because tomorrow, we have work to do. Amen.